So hello everyone, week 14.2, closing towards the very end of the full stack part, almost about to begin. The open source contributions part. Timing works pretty well for everyone, I think, because perfect time to start contributing to GSOC, and GSOC is now open to everyone, not just college students. So if you've not done GSOC before, you can participate this year. I would strongly urge to start right now and not wait for another 3-4 months when the competition increases and a lot of people start contributing and you scramble to look at issues, find things, and at the same time understand the code base. At least start understanding the code base right now, and you have enough JavaScript knowledge, enough TypeScript knowledge. And the good thing is that GSOC projects are much simpler compared to open source repositories of big companies, and the reason is that they're sometimes very old, written a few years ago, sometimes not in TypeScript, just in JavaScript. Today I'm releasing a video on YouTube where I'm contributing to such a project that's written completely in JavaScript, and I think if you followed all videos until now, it should be fairly straightforward for you to understand, because it uses Express as the backend, it uses Mongoose as the ORM, it uses MongoDB as the database, and plain JavaScript they've written their code. I think their front end, I'm not sure what their front end is in. I did not. Oh, their front end is in React. The issue that I solved is sort of a React issue, and their backend is in Node.js. So the project is this one, p5.js. Is maybe specifically the project that I've contributed to is a project called p5.js web editor. So this is one project you can start contributing to. Processing is an organization that has been coming for the past 12 years to Google Summer of Code, so there is a high probability they come. If not this one, their main library is p5.js. Basically these two projects, most of their GSOC projects are either in this or in this, and both of these are JavaScript projects. This is a fairly small JavaScript project, this is slightly bigger, and their p5js.org, the code of this website as well, is in JavaScript. So would strongly urge you to start going out of your comfort zone and looking at code bases, and we can also set up one of these code bases, understanding everything in the weeks to come. Cool. Today's class is about Trpc, more specifically a continuation of what we did yesterday, understanding context, middleware, how to integrate Trpc with React, how to integrate Trpc with Next.js. So we'll do these 4 things today. Shouldn't be too long. Hopefully we finish by 8:45 India time, and then we can discuss more about what projects we want to start to pick up now, because there's just 1 or 2 weeks left where we have to cover containerization, how to write tests, and GraphQL. These are the big things we need to cover. Then let's just dive right into it and start looking at projects, and then learn by doing, because I think these things, doing things yourself, we've spent enough time doing things slowly and taking things slow and understanding things from the very basic. Now is the time where I would start looking at projects yourself and looking at other whatever technology a project is using yourself. For example, GraphQL ho gayi, I would urge you to just open it yourself, understand how it happens under the hood, or maybe MySQL as the database. Understand how it works with Prisma, how it's different from Postgres and Mongoose, things like these. Start to do these things yourself, because if we do 3 open source projects, let's say, the 4th one you'll open yourself and you'll have to understand yourself, right? So thoda start gaining context yourself. Today I'll cover a lot of the Trpc bits, but there might be things that we leave, and then would urge you to do them yourself, and I'll also cover them in an offline video if you're not able to cover all of this today. Although my hope is we should be able to do all of this in the next 1.5 hours. Alright, cool. Let's get right into it. Maybe let's do a quick recap of what we did yesterday. So yesterday we understood, let me just go back to the slides from yesterday. Let's go maybe from the top. We said Trpc is a moderately hard concept, will require some marination, and it is not used everywhere. It's in fact cal.com is the only project that I've seen it being used in. Although I've also started using this recently only. Seems very powerful when you're trying to write TypeScript code. It gives you very nice type safety on the front end and the back end. Cool. Why TypeScript? There were 2 high-level reasons. Automatic types on front end and back end, and gives you a generic code that you can deploy to an Express backend, an Next.js backend, or whatever new fancy backend technology comes in the future. Yesterday we deployed it using their standalone adapter. Today we will deploy it using the Next.js adapter. These are the famous sort of adapters. Fastify is a very nice sort of service that lets you host backend services. Lambda is a serverless service by AWS, and you just have to write your code once in those routers that we discussed yesterday, and then it can be converted and deployed in any one of these backend frameworks. The HTTP server we don't write. We just write the logic of what our routers look like, which means at what function name and what arguments do what on the backend, and then the underlying deployment engine can be changed based on whatever fancy technology comes in the future. Right now, Next.js is the most popular one, and then Express is the one that we've done until now. If a new one comes in the future, you don't have to rewrite your code. You just have to change the adapter that you're using, and you're good to go. We discussed some concepts, which are basically the things that I discussed here. More importantly, the concepts here were there is a thing called router, there are queries, and there are mutations. These are the three things you need to know, and then you can start writing a basic backend for an RPC. How to write the code. If this was the app.get that we've done until now in Express, this is how it would look like in TRPC, where you have a top level router which has a function. This function is similar to an endpoint here, and the function has an input. The input needs to be very well defined. This is the shape of the input using Zod. And finally, if you're doing a get, which means you're only trying to get data, not update it, you use a query here. If you're trying to update data on the server, you use a mutation here, and then you write your logic, which is the same logic you would write here in the get handler for an HTTP server in Express. On the client side, for Express, you do a fetch call. For this, you simply do a what's called a remote procedure call, which means you simply call a function called toDoCreate, pass in the right arguments, which is title and description, and under the hood there is an HTTP call that happens, but you never see it as the application developer, the person who's writing the front end code. You simply see a function call, which is the call to toDoCreate. Let's create a basic to-do server and client. Uske baad we created a very basic server which had a to-do function, a create to-do function, and a very basic client that could call that specific function on it, and we saw it was getting the right response. After this, we discussed two things that were important. One is context and the other was middlewares. We only discussed contexts yesterday. Today we want to discuss middlewares. What were contexts? Basically, any backend application, be it in Golang, be it in Rust, or be it in Node.js, usually has some very request specific data which is stored in the thing called context. So it's just a commonly used name which is used across languages, where you store their users, usually authentication information, which means who this user is, and a bunch of database variables that let you put data in the database. The reason you store this in this context variable and not a global mongoose variable is if you store it in a context variable, when you're writing tests for this, your life becomes very easy because databases are usually mocked during tests. You don't actually have a database where you put data. When you're running tests, you mock a database, and if you define that as a global variable in your Node.js application, it's slightly harder to mock. It's easier to mock if it's part of your context. So that's why these are the two sort of things that you keep in your context for any application, not just TRPC, but TRPC lets you very easily define this thing called the context and put data there. What is the data we put there usually? The authorization information, who this user is, who's trying to hit this endpoint, and a bunch of database variables, which is like the global Prisma variable, global mongoose variable, so on and so forth. All right. And then we wrote some context variables yesterday. Cool. Let's look at the code from yesterday quickly, marinate it, and then we'll get into the class today, which is we're going to understand four things. Context, just quick revision. Middlewares, actually understanding how you create middlewares in TRPC. Integrated with React. So we did not do any nice clients yesterday. We wrote a very simple Node.js client. We should be able to integrate it with React and understand how TRPC works with React, and then integrating it with Next.js. All right, let's get right into it. Let's get to the first part, which is context. Maybe let's not revise. Let's create a fresh project and do things there. So we can do one of two things. I have written the whole thing once, which has context, which has middleware, which has a React integration and a Next.js integration. We can slowly go through that on the video today and then have time for questions later on, or we can code it from scratch as well, and then you can code along with me. I will do a poll, and then based on that we will proceed. How should we code today? Code from scratch. This will take longer, might not be able to cover everything, and look at code, follow along. Alright, going to do a poll. Please select whatever option you deem fit, and then based on that we can proceed. Alright, so look at code, follow along, won by a little bit, which is 60%, and then I think that makes sense as well because there's a lot to cover today. Let's try to cover it slowly, and then you have the code, you can look at it later on and maybe write it yourself by doing two things. So how did I write this code? I have not done too much TRPC in the past. I wrote this code based on these documentations. What were the things we had to do? Context. So I went to backend usage here. I went to context and I read how you create context for a TRPC application. Next thing we had to do is middlewares. What did I do? I went here. I understood how middlewares are written in TRPC. So TRPC is very new. Even I think I did not check, but most probably ChatGPT won't be able to help you with TRPC and write TRPC code for you. So you anyways had to go through documentations, and I generally, when I'm learning something new, go through documentations to solve it. So this is how I have created the project that we're going through today. And after I did these two things, I went to client usage and I looked at this React query integration and then Next.js integration. And one more thing I looked at was hosting TRPC adapters, the Next.js adapters. These are the 5 sort of blocks that I looked at, and based on these I created the project that we'll be looking at today. So would urge you to, when you're done with this class, let's say you create a different application or the same application, go through this and try to write it yourself rather than just looking at mine and be like, I know everything, because until you write things you'll not understand it. All right, this is the repository for today, which is 100x-devs-kirath/week 14. As you can see, it has a client folder which is just basic client that we did yesterday, a next folder which has a Next.js integration, a React folder which has a React integration, and a server folder which has our TRPC code. Let's copy this and going to paste it in chat. If I have Discord open, maybe I'll paste it there as well. I would urge you to clone it locally. I already have it locally, so I don't have to do that. Please clone this project locally and open it in VS Code, and then we can go from there. Discord is not opening, so you will have to look at the Zoom chat. Hopefully I'm not sure if this Zoom chat is clickable. A bunch of times it isn't. So if that's the case, please go to this 100x-devs-kirath and it will be the repository at the top, the week 14 repository. Please bring it locally onto your VS Code. I'm going to do the same. So wait for 30 seconds. 30 seconds is fine. $20 more seconds. If you already opened it, feel free to run npm install and get all the dependencies locally. Just run it in the root folder for now. We'll slowly move to the React Next.js folder and do things there. All right, 10 more seconds. Oh, Discord link is not. Yeah, someone Kamlesh. I know that's the issue. We'll fix it today. Okay, how to find out? Okay. Yeah, you can look at organizations from 2023 as a reference for finding organizations in GSOC 2024. All right. Cool. Let's run a top level npm install. Just run it in the top level folder right now. Don't worry about all the other folders. Let's start to explore the server folder here. This is something we wrote yesterday as well, which was the step 1 to creating a TRPC server was, if I go to getting started, create an empty folder, run npm install at trpc server at trpc client there. If you go to the top level folder here and you look at package.json, you will see at trpc server and at trpc client, both of these here. So these dependencies I brought to my top level project, the top level package.json. I initialized this using npm init-y. I also initialized tsconfig.json, and then I brought these two. Then you had to do two things if you remember from yesterday. Step 1 is initializing. You go to server, index.ts, no sorry, trpc.ts, initializing of the trpc backend. Whenever you are creating a trpc app, the first thing you have to do is call init trpc dot create. If you ignore this middle part, I'm going to remove this. This is what we did yesterday, and in the end I also showed how can you create the context of a global context of a trpc server. This is something we did yesterday, and then at the end we saw कि अच्छा, if you want to give some user ID to the context of every request, you pass it as a generic to the dot context function. Do we remember this from yesterday? Let me open chat here. Sorry, poll here. Never mind. Let me quickly teach this once and then we can do a poll. We did a trpc.create. Maybe ignore this part if you don't understand it right now. At least this part hopefully is something you remember from yesterday. Then we exported two things yesterday. We did not export this middleware. You can ignore this for now as well. Export const router equal to t.router. Export const public procedure equal to t.procedure. What was the router? It was the top level first router. It was a router variable that you can use throughout your index.ts file or other files that we have created here, and that lets you create a route or like a function for your backend. And public procedure was the thing that lets you create a procedure. So let's just look at the usage rather than looking at what their name is. So if you look at the usage from yesterday was slightly simpler than the usage today. So let's maybe look at the usage from yesterday. If you look at the project from yesterday, week 14 checkpoint, the server folder had just two files, index.ts and trpc.ts. Today it has too many files. So let's first just look at this. If you look at index.ts, sorry, maybe trpc.ts we should see first. What did it do? Init trpc.context. What is the context? Just the username dot create, and then exported router and public procedure. Hopefully this part we remember from yesterday. These are the two things you have to do in trpc. The index.ts is where you actually defined your HTTP routes ka equivalent in trpc, which is like methods. How did we do it? We said the global app router has a sign up function, has a create to do function. What does the sign up function look like? Public procedure, which comes from ./trpc. What is the input for this function? An email and a password. It is a mutation because some data is being changed on the server. We used to get email and password from ops.input.email, ops.input.password. You have to do some database stuff here and then return whatever the token after doing a jwt.verify, sorry, jwt.sign. Similarly, we have a create to do function which has an input, does whatever it's supposed to, and then finally returns something. And we created the HTTP server. The extra thing we did at the very end of the class was this create context function. Okay, maybe before that, where does this create HTTP server come from? It comes from the standalone adapter, which means this is logic you only write once, the app router. This is logic you write based on where you're deploying your application. If you're deploying it using the standalone adapter, you write this. When we will deploy it using Next.js later on, we will write something else here. We will use a separate adapter rather than using the standalone adapter. So this is the logic you have to write once. This is the logic you write based on where you're deploying. For this guy, it's you define the server and you call server.listen. And this was the type that we exported, which we used in various places. That's how the client got very nice types when it was trying to interact with the server. Is this part a good recap of everything we did from yesterday? We all remember all of this, including the context part. We will of course, oh sorry, this is the wrong poll. We will of course do this again where we understand how you do context in a to-do application. But from yesterday, do we understand everything? All right, very good. Okay, so let's proceed. Now today what we're doing is we're creating a full-blown to-do application, which means the user can sign up, the user can sign in, the user can get their own information from the /me endpoint or like the me procedure. User can create a to-do, user can get all the to-dos that they've done, user can update a to-do. So we have to have 6 such functions, but writing 6 such functions in a top level index.ts file looks very ugly. This is something that someone pointed out yesterday, and thankfully Trpc gives you a solution, which was called merge routers. So the first thing we are going to learn today, before we learn context and we learn about middlewares, is how you can merge 2, 3, 5, how many routers you want together. There is one way to do it, which is using merge routers. We have not used that today. The other way to do it is you can have nested routes, which means okay, this is a global router. It has a user, not function exactly, but a user, which is also a router, and that's defined in a different file. And then to do, which is defined in a different file. All right. Rather than doing user is a public procedure dot something, I said user is a router in itself. And if I go to the user router, so in the I have a routers folder which has 2 different routers. One is the user router, one has the to-do router. If I go to the user router, here you can see I said user router is a router which has a sign up function, has a login function, and has a me function. I will take you through each one of these one by one, but at a high level, hopefully this part is clear. Okay, we have just structured our project a little well, and whenever we are calling this on the front end, if you go to client/index.ts, this is the way you call it: trpc.user.signup.mutate. So rather than doing trpc.signup.mutate, since at the very top we have the user, which is this thing right here, which then points to the user router which has the sign up function, the way to call it on the client is trpc.user.signup.mutate. If I hover over this and click here, it takes me here to the top level app router on this user key. If I hover over sign up and I click here, it takes me to the user router. So this is how you can structure your project well, and this is how usually routers will be defined in various files. Is this part straightforward? All right, 80%. What's the doubt that the 20% have? Any part that's one simple thing that I'm missing? What part did you not understand? Just repeat. Okay, let's pause chat, repeat. All right. So yesterday wala part we understand. Yesterday wala part was, this is from yesterday, where we just have 2 files, very simple. An index.ts file, a trpc.ts file. Ignore trpc.ts file for now. Index.ts file, this is how you define all your functions. Today what we could have done, this is a to-do application. It requires 6 endpoints. Create the to-do, get all my to-dos, and update a to-do. Sign up, sign in, and me endpoint that returns me my information. I could simply write all 6 of these here. Or I can say, bhai user, go here. Admin, create or to-dos, go here. So rather than having 6 functions defined here or 6 keys defined here, I just defined 2 keys, a user key and a to-do key, user key and a to-do key. And I said all the user logic is here in user router. And what does user router look like? It looks exactly like this top level router from yesterday. This is also a router, and this router has a sign up function, a login function, and a me function. That way, if in the future you're creating a course selling app, there will be a separate course router and then separate user router. If there are admins, a separate admin router. Each one, these are basically similar to these files that we had in week 8. If you go back to the week 8 repository, we had all the routes for to-dos in a different file: router.post, router.get, router.patch, and auth, router.post, router.login, so on and so forth. Similar to these 2 files, I've created 2 different files here inside the routers folder. So in fact, the name also is very similar: router/to-do, router/user. It was routes/auth and routes/to-do. So just separating it out into different files. Hopefully this part is clear now. We'll do a poll very soon again. Let's go back to index.ts. Let's see what else we have done. If you did not understand this part, just put, or you can assume that we can put the 6 functions here. That will also work. Your client will change a little bit, but you can put all the 6 things here. This is slightly better structured because you can have user routes separate, to-do routes separate. All right. The next thing we did yesterday was simply create HTTP server. We did not have this very complicated create context that I have. Simply did, and even this, we simply did this. Okay, create HTTP server, router, app router, and then we started our backend. This worked, but right now it is complaining. Why is it complaining? It is complaining because if you go to trpc.ts, I have said कि भाई init trpc.context, which means my request, every request that comes in needs to have something extra in there along with the request and the response. If you go back to our Express server, here whenever request reached a certain endpoint, for example router.get/me, other than the request and the response, there was actually one more thing I needed, which was the user ID that we would grab in this authenticate JWT middleware. We propagated it in a very ugly fashion. Put it in the header and propagate it to the next function. This is very ugly. What is the cleaner way to do it? The cleaner way to put these user ID variables in such middlewares is using the context. Like, what is a context? It's just a name that is used, which means that anytime an endpoint is being called, give some extra context along with it. In our case, what is the context? It's this user ID. This is how we did it here in Express. What is the equivalent in TRPC? The equivalent in TRPC is, number one, define the shape of your context. Now here I've written too many things, so let me remove this for now. It can simply be ki our context, which means anytime control reaches here, needs to have a user ID, which is optional. If the user is logged in, user ID will exist. If they are not logged in, user ID will be undefined. And then if you remember from yesterday, even in TRPC documentation, and I also told, okay, other than user information, the other thing that you store here is usually your global Prisma variable or your global Mongoose variable, or the thing that I've stored here, which is I said that there is also a DB variable, which is an object which has two keys, a to do and a user. What are these? These are our schemas from Mongoose. So if you go back to the Express application, here in server/db, we had defined the schemas of our MongoDB variable, and using these user and to do models, sorry, not schemas, models, you could actually interact with the database and put data there, get data from there, all that jazz. You can do the same thing in our application today. So even in our application today, if you look at the folders, ignore middleware folders, routers we have understood, index.ts we have understood, trpc.ts we have sort of understood. There is also a DB folder which looks exactly the same from week 8 as well, which is it just defines your schemas and it exports your models. Now you can use these models globally. If I go to routers/todo.ts, I could simply be like yahan pe ke whatever todo dot, rather than doing whatever very long complicated string here that I've written here, I can simply do new todo and I can import this from DB. That works as well. So if I do todo here and I press enter, I can import todo globally from a different file as well, but usually you get it from this context variable. How it's propagated here we will see, but this is how usually your database, so if you're using Prisma, your Prisma variable which will also come from opt.ctx.prisma dot, you will do whatever user by ID. And why is this done? Why are these not picked up globally? One, it is helpful during testing because you can simply be like todo router dot todo create dot call with some with this specific context. Whenever you are testing these routes, whenever you write the test for them, you can actually pass the context in by default. You can force a specific context. So what you can do is you will force the Prisma variable here to basically do nothing. This is an empty variable. So something actually doesn't get stored into your database when you are writing tests, because when you write tests, you don't actually want to bring up a database. Whenever you write tests, you just test the application logic. You don't actually bring up a database and put real data there. So that is one of the biggest reasons why you pass these in the context rather than importing these as global variables. The other reason is that if you want to ever switch between Mongoose to some other ORM, you just have to make that change in one place as long as that sort of schema is the same. for the different ORMs, and you just change it one place and everywhere it gets propagated, versus if it was imported from the top here, you would have to import it in 10 different places. So this is the reason these two things, which is the user's information and the mongoose variable or the Prisma variable or whatever ORM you're using, are usually stored where? In the context of every request. Now, where do you define the shape of the context? You define it here in trpc.ts, which is why I said कि हाँ एक तो user ID, secondly database stuff, which is a to-do and a user. These two models should also be part of the context. How we make them part of the context we will see, but the shape is defined here. And why? Because these two are good to have during requests and use out of the box, like this ops.ctx.db.todo. So this db variable is this db variable and to-do is this. So, and ctx stands for context. How we put it in the context we will see. But is this part clear कि हाँ the shape of the context I understand कि हाँ database we put there, user ID we put there, how we put there we will see. But why is it this much? Is this clear? Very popular interview question कि हाँ why would you put database information here? And the answer is, one, for writing tests it's easier to mock things. Two, you need access to the user ID during authorization authentication. All right, 83%, which is not great, but we will still proceed and then take a pause and then discuss more. Let's understand, now that you've defined the context shape, or like how the context looks like, how do you actually put context inside each and every request? And the answer is this create context function right here. This is different for every adapter. So on the Next.js adapter, there's a slightly different way to write it. On this standalone adapter, the create HTTP server comes from where? Comes from the standalone adapter. Here, the way to write context or like add context to every request is this create context function. Now, what does this guy need to do? It needs to put the database things here. It needs to return something. It basically needs to return something like this: db to do whatever user and then user ID something. It needs to return something like this. The user ID it needs to get from where? From the headers, because whoever will send the request, we are assuming they will send the JWT along with the request. And this is the first place that the request hits, the create context function. We need to extract the JWT from the headers and verify it, and only if it is something it verifies correctly, we put the user ID there in the context, and then the actual function gets access to it. If not, we put something like null here or undefined. And the second thing we put here is to do and user, which we can simply get from the global variables here. Here is where you can get user and to do from global variables and put it in the context. If in the future your ORM changes, you can make those changes directly here. That's the theoretical reason, but it won't practically work because every ORM has a different schema. Just because to do dot create works somewhere in one ORM doesn't mean the create function will work in another ORM. So this isn't really a good reason to say that's why I'm keeping to do and user in the context. But test wise reason is sort of valid. All right. So this is something, again, if you don't want to, don't. If you don't want to feel like understanding context, especially this part, you don't have to put it there. You can simply, in your router, import it globally from at the top, import to do from wherever, and then work. But this is how usually it is done everywhere, even like cal.com's code base. The Prisma variable is part of the context. So it's good for you to know why it is done, and hopefully you should actually do it also. Question is, how do you extract JWT here? This part will feel a little tricky, especially this promisified part will seem a little tricky. I don't want to spend too much time explaining it, but at the same time, we will try to understand this part, which will, I feel, is going to feel a little difficult to few people. So let's take a breather here and remember what and how the middleware worked in our applications until now. Until now, how did middlewares work? We had the authenticate JWT function. It would get the request. It would get the header from it. It would extract the token from it, because the header looked something like this: bearer space some random token, it would extract this token from this full string, store it in this token variable, and then it would call jwt.verify on the token. This function has a callback where it gets whether or not the token verification succeeded. If it did, then error is not null. If error does exist, then that means token verification fail, and here we would stop the request right here and return 403. We have to do something very similar here in the create context function. We get the authorization header. Again, we assume that the user is sending their header, the authorization header, along with whenever they're making the call. If the authorization header does exist, you have to do some things. Let's come to what that is. But if it doesn't exist, which means either an else, or you don't really need an else here, because if it succeeds, something will be returned, and then this will only run if did not run, which means this is similar to this. Either of these two work. So let's put an else here and return what? DB to do user. Where do these come from? These I've imported at the very top right here. If the user did not send an auth header, life is simple. I simply put to do and user in the context and I call it a day. If the user did send a token, I get a auth header, I get the token from it. Now I need to do the JWT verification. What is the way to do it? The way to do it is this: jwt.verify, give it the token, give it the secret, and in the callback function you get something. The problem is this function needs to return not immediately, but the final thing it needs to return should look something like this: user, to do, and user ID. But the problem is jwt.verify runs like this. It has a token and a secret and a callback function. So, and here is where you sort of get access to the user ID. The question is how do I return over here or get access to user ID over here and be able to return it without, even though I get access to the user ID here in the callback function. I will repeat this. Let's actually make this slightly simpler. कितने लोगों को ये already समझ आ रहा है? How many of you already get कि हाँ, you need to just promisify this and you're good to go? Somehow, basically this code, how many of you already understand? And how many of you are stuck कि हाँ ये थोड़ा weird हो गया? Return new promise, jwt.verify, and then if user does exist, we call resolve, and then if the verification did fail, which means there was an error, then we resolve just the db to do user, and if it did not succeed, it did succeed, then we resolve with not just the db but also the user ID. This part, do you already understand? Just want to know how many understand this already. Give me a yes if you do. Okay, very nice, 50-50. So yeah, this part let's dive a little deeper into. The thing we have to do is, if I comment this complicated thing, if you have access to the token, you have to call this jwt.verify function, and you will, whenever this finishes, it's an async function, does its thing, does the verification. Whenever it succeeds, the control reaches here. Here I have access to user.userid. I want to return from this create context function this user.userid. The problem is this user.userid exists in this callback function. It does not sort of exist outside it. How can I return this from this create context function when it doesn't? How will the control flow be here? This line will run, this line will run, this line will run, and control will reach here. The line inside here will only run after a point because it's a callback function. This is how asynchronous JavaScript works, right? Okay, this line runs, then jwt.verify runs, and you keep moving on. The JavaScript thread proceeds. Whenever this verification succeeds, and whenever it gets pushed to the call stack, this callback function, then it gets called. The return will happen from whatever is here, and if there is nothing here, that means undefined will get returned. But we want to return something. The problem is jwt.verify doesn't immediately give us the answer. The answer comes inside the callback function. How do you fix this problem? So that is sort of a high level question, which is a smaller problem we are solving. Forget TRPC for now. This is probably more important than TRPC. Understanding what exactly is happening here and how do you solve this problem. How does a function, it is an async function. Let me write async here. It has access to, let me actually remove everything, forget everything, just focus on this part. There is a create context function, and inside the create context, inside the create context function, there is it needs to return user ID. Okay, it needs to return user ID, which could be null, could be some string. The problem is how do you get access to user ID? By calling jw.verify, and in this callback function you get the user ID. How can I return this user ID from this function? The problem is this function mein control reaches here, and then control reaches this whatever console.log high line, and then control reaches here, nothing gets returned. Create context complains, I did not get access to user ID, I should have. What can we do? One answer might feel like this, return use jw.verify. Whenever this happens, maybe it returns this. The answer is this will not work, because this, at this point you're saying whatever jw.verify returns, you should return here, and jw.verify does not return this. It might return null, it might return something else. Just because there is a function here which returns something does not mean jw.verify returns the same thing. Simple example might be, if I write a jwt verify function which takes a token which is a string as an input, a secret which is a string as an input, and a callback function which is any for now, let's say, and here I call callback with whatever null comma 1, and if I do const a equal to jwt verify some random token, some random secret, and a callback function, whatever user ID I get here, which if I actually call this, it will be 1. This might feel very confusing. It should. Asynchronous programming is a little confusing, so bear with me a little here. Even if I return user ID here, what does A have access to? A has access to whatever jwt verify returns. What does jwt verify returns? It returns literally nothing. It calls callback, that is a different thing. But what does it return? It returns nothing. So A will have undefined as the value here, which is why you can't simply be like return jwt.verify. The answer to this problem, how you get access to this user ID and make this function return whatever user ID comes here, is called promisifying this callback function. I repeat, what is it called? It's called promisifying this callback function. What does that mean? How many of us understand promises already? Thoda. This is sort of important and will confuse you a lot later on if you don't understand this well. Okay, we already understand promises. Good janta, 82-83%. We have used promises until now. We haven't created functions that return promises, which is what we will understand now for the next 10 minutes before we proceed. Using promises is usually simple. A bunch of times we have done whatever mongoose.user.create .then and then .catch. The mongoose.user.create function returns a promise, which is why you are able to do these things. I can also do let x equal to await mongoose.user.create, and here also mongoose.user.create returns a promise. Whenever that promise resolves or succeeds is when you get access to something here in X. So there are 3 ways to write an asynchronous function. Let's say there's a mongoose.user.create function. You can either call it like this, or you can call it like x mongoose.user.create .then. You get access to whatever this guy is returning, X, or it is mongoose.user.create X. These are 3 ways in which a mongoose.user.create function, which let's say writes something into the database, so which is an asynchronous function, might take some time. These are 3 ways you can get access to the variable inside it. Either you await on it and then you get value X here, or you call mongoose.user.create .then and you get access to X here, or if mongoose.user.create does support callbacks, which is not necessary. That is why this does not work here, because jwt.verify does not support promises. And if mongoose.user.create does not support callbacks, then this won't work. But if it does, this is the third way to get access to whatever response you get from mongoose.user.create. If this function is asynchronous, which means it takes some time. These are usually interchangeable. You can use any one of these three, but it is not necessary that a function that supports these two things, which means it returns a promise, also supports this thing, which is it returns a callback, and vice versa. If a function, an asynchronous function, does support a callback, doesn't mean it will support promises, and vice versa. Although usually most modern libraries that are written support both. This library does not. This library only supports what? Promisified result, callback result, which is, okay, you call verify and you get access to the final thing in this callback. The question is, how can I convert this to a promise? If I can do that, then my life is good. If I can write let user ID equal to await jwt.verify token and secret, and then simply return user ID, then my life is sorted. Question is, how can I do that, considering jwt.verify does not support this natively? The answer is, you create a new function called promisified verify, which takes the same arguments as input, take token and secret. But the first thing it does at the very top is it returns a promise. Return new promise. Resolve. Maybe just ignore the other thing. What does this guy return? It does not return an integer. It does not return a string. It returns something called a promise. What is a promise? Basically, is something that takes some time to finish. That's what a promise is. It's like a promise ki haan, this is something that will eventually succeed. Right now it does not. This is what you get access to. If I did let user ID equal to jwt.verify, I would get access to the promise variable here. If I do the await, I will get access to whatever is called from resolve whenever in the future. I repeat, this resolve function, ignoring for now where it comes from, whenever it gets called here with whatever arguments that it is called, that is what will come here in the user ID variable. Which means if I do a jwt.verify token secret user ID and call resolve user ID here, this user ID will reach here whenever this resolve gets called. And now this function of mine, if I call this promisified verify, I can await on it and return it right from here, rather than doing nothing else. There is no other way for you to sort of return this other than promisifying jwt.verify. So a good term to learn here is, how can you promisify any synchronous function that doesn't support a promise? There are also libraries that let you do it. In fact, there's a library called Promisify that lets you do exactly the same thing. It basically writes all of this logic for you, but rather than using it, I have written it from scratch. And this is sort of an important interview question. Given this function, promisify it, and this is sort of the answer for it. Takes some time to getting used to it, but at a high level, this is how this specific part sort of works, and this is unfortunately the only way to do it. If you're using this JWT library, there are promisified versions of JWT library that you can use, and then your life will be much easier. Since we are using our JSON Web Tokens library, this is a sort of only way that you can do this. So let me press Command Z a few times. Let's revert the file. Let me just call git reset hard to reset everything, and let's look at it again now from a fresh mind. Index.ts. Let's look at the context. Create context function again. What does it do? If the auth header does exist, get the token from the auth header. Since the header will look something like this, bearer space the actual token, we get this actual value here in this token variable. Once you get it, rather than returning jwt.verify or doing some other magic that you might feel will return the user ID, we do what? We return a new promise. You could also create a new function like we just did and do the same thing, or you can simply return a promise from here. I return a promise if maybe ignore this generic for now, but this generic basically tells what the shape of what this promise would resolve. You can remove this for now. Yeah, maybe just remove this now. We have a TS ignore, so your life will be fine. So returns a new promise which resolves when GW.verify is called. Now, is this promisifying an archaic callback function and how it is done? Is this part clear? Pretty good. So 84%, which is great. The people who did not understand it, if JW.verify was a synchronous function, then your life would have been very simple. You could simply write return JWT.verify or whatever. Let user ID equal to JWT.verify, all that jazz, and then return user ID. The problem is user ID. JWT.verify is an asynchronous function and it is not promisified, which is why you can't simply turn it from here. We promisify it, and this is a common interview question. So promises were introduced very late in like 2016, 2017. Before that, a lot of functions, like there was no concept of promises. This is how you would write callback functions, which is like there would always be a third callback argument, which is a function that would get called. When promises were introduced, a lot of libraries sort of ported over to promises by doing this thing that we've done today for this, which is promisifying the thing. All right. Good to know that 85% understands this, which is great. So let's take a pause and let's maybe finish the context bit and then take a pause and move to middlewares. All right. What should the create context function do again? Get the auth header, get access to the token, call JW.verify. If this succeeds, then return the user ID along with, of course, DB mein jo to do and user were there. If it does not succeed, which means it does not get access to user, then simply resolve with DB to do user, which is the same thing you do here in case the auth header doesn't exist. Only in this case do you give the DB as well as the user ID to, where does this go eventually? It goes into one of these routers, like any of these routers, any function that gets called. You will have access to ops.ctx.db.user or ops.ctx.db.user ID. Oh, sorry, not user ID, simply user ID. So if I press dot here, I can either get user ID, which is what? It is an optional string or undefined, or db dot to do or user, which are like the database variables that I can use to create database entries. All right. So hopefully this context or the part how to create context is clear. Until now, we've only created the context. We get access to that context here. We haven't yet understood middlewares and how we can use middlewares to block requests reaching here or control reaching here based on certain conditions. That is what we will discuss next, which is middlewares. Until now, what have we discussed? Just a recap of Trpc from yesterday, context, and most important thing we have learned today is how do you promisify old archaic callback functions, which is probably the one thing you should practice a lot because it's like a very basic JavaScript concept that you need to know. All right. Just a quick vibe check. How are we doing? Are we doing good? Are we doing not doing good? So are we doing good? Yes or no? All right. Okay, good. 82% is 79% is doing good. So break for 79%. Chat open for 22%. क्या हो गया बताओ? Which part is overwhelming? We can talk through it. Promise part. Pause करते हैं. Initialize user ID equal to undefined before JW.verify. Then we can get assign. Initialize user ID before JW.verify. Something like this. Then we can get assign. I did not understand the question. Can you elaborate on it when I open chat again? Can we write the return in place of resolve and remove the promise? That is the thing. You cannot. You cannot write return here and it will work. It won't, because as I explained before with an example here, let's say this whoever wrote this JWT.verify function, this was the logic that they wrote. What does it expect? A token, a secret, and a callback function. function, this thing accepts 3 things, and what does it do? Does some checks using token and secret. There'll be some logic here. Eventually when that logic runs, could be very long logic. Then it calls callback with, let's say, some user ID 1. This is the control, this is the logic for the this JWT verify function. Assume this is a JWT verify function you've written on your own, which takes 3 arguments, just logs the token, logs the secret, and then returns CV1. If I call JWT verify and I pass in some string, another secret string, and do a callback function which gets access to user ID. If I return user ID here, and let's say I return this thing inside a function, what do you think the main function will return? Will it return this 1, which is what comes here in the user ID variable, or will it return undefined? What do you think it will return, 1 or undefined? Undefined, that is correct. Okay, someone posted something that also may not work, but let me get to that in a second. It will return undefined. The only way this main function can return this user ID is if you promisify JWT verify, which is what sort of we do here. Now someone said this thing, can't do this, Harkirat. Let user ID equal to undefined JWT.verify, and then user ID equal to whatever user. This should work because let user ID equal to undefined, and यहाँ पे हमने user ID को access कर दिया, and if I return user ID here, shouldn't this work? The answer is no. Why? Control will first reach here, then it will reach this line. This callback doesn't get called immediately, so it will reach this line, then it will actually reach this line, it will return undefined, and then after 1 second, 2 seconds, 100 milliseconds will the control reach here, and user ID will get updated. You can write this works. Control will reach here, control will not reach here for a while. Control will go here, will go in this line, will go to this line, undefined will get returned, and then after 100 milliseconds, however time it might take for JWT.verify to run, will control reach here, and so this approach is also incorrect. Alright, can we return in place instead of resolve? So I think all these questions are along the lines of promisifying JWT.verify. So all these sort of solutions which might seem right may not work, because always keep in mind, okay, control doesn't immediately reach here. It's not like it reaches here and then it reaches this line and then it reaches this line. No, it goes here, then it goes here, then eventually whenever JWT.verify resolves, does the control reach here. Alright. Are we assuming that user will send the token, and if he does, then the whole promise thing? But if the user doesn't send any token, why are we returning to do and user in the return statement? Shouldn't we return something like unauthorized? Good question. That is where middlewares will come into the picture. But the short answer to your question is, as long as we are sending user ID undefined here, whoever is using this later on, this is the first place where your request reaches. Iske baad your request will reach here. Not here, yeah, here, or any of these handlers. Here you can always check if not opts.ctx.userid, then whatever, return. And when we use middlewares, it will not even happen here, it will happen in a middleware. But the idea is the context's purpose is to simply extract context. Its purpose is not to block the request. That is where middlewares come into the picture. But that is a good question. So accessing context should be an async call if we are returning a promise from it. Yes, but that is correct. But someone else is calling this. We are not calling this. Trpc internally is calling this, and it knows that this is an asynchronous call, so it will await it basically. Yeah. In the promisfied example, we awaited it. Where are we awaiting the new promise returned? In the create context function. Where are we awaiting the new promise? That is the thing. It is not we who have to await it. Whoever calls create context will have to await it. And who is the person who's calling create context in this case? It is the Trpc library. Whenever a new request comes in, control will reach this create context function before it reaches the actual handler. It is Trpc who will call this create context function, and it knows it needs to await create context wherever it is calling it. But we never call it, so we never see this function call. We only define the function. Whose purpose is it to call this function? It is Trpc. When a request comes to the Trpc server, alright? That's why we never had to await it. More questions, please. Just add an await before jw.verify. jw.verify does not support promises. The jw.verify function doesn't return a promise. That's what I said. It is a library that does not yet support jw promises. So this would have been great if jw.verify returned a promise, but it always returns a void, which means it returns nothing. Most modern libraries do this. They will give you callback support. They will also give you promise support, which means you can either do this or you can do await verify, let user ID equal to this, whatever. But this library does not do that yet. So that is why there is a promiseified JWT library out there. Or you can use a promiseify library to promiseify anything. But this JWT library does not support this. Someone else also gave a very nice, seems like ChatGPT answer, which also I think will fail here. So let's look at that. Oh, oopsie daisy, cannot copy it. Copy. All right. Oh, no, it's not an answer. It seems like. So what this person has done is promiseified set timeout, which is also a very popular question. Okay, whenever you call, like interview question, whenever you call set timeout, we have been calling it something like this. A good sort of exercise to take from today is we call set timeout like this. This also sort of doesn't support promises. This is also a very heavily callback based API. How can you promiseify it? And sort of the answer is the thing that the person posted in chat here, which is this, which you can read about and is also very popular interview question. Promiseify set timeout. The answer is this. But yeah, let's move to some actual more questions here. All right. Any more questions? Basic question. Does create context function not need a key? What do you mean by a key? What do you mean by a key? Summary. Promiseify any function which are written sync, example JWT, and doesn't yet support promises. Token and the other outer function is async. Once the controller is to JWT, it looks some time to process it, but the controller is already moved on to other part and returns undefined. That is mota correct. Yes, okay. Just because jw.verify is here, returning this will not do anything because jw.verify returns a void. And if you try to return something, whatever here, this is what will finally get returned. This will totally get missed because this is inside a callback, which happens after 1 second, milliseconds, 10 milliseconds, whenever. You never know whenever jw.verify succeeds. So yes, your understanding of this is correct. Ayush Kumar. Now, Sneha, can you ask that question again? Key wala, and then we'll sort of proceed. Why do you use TS ignore? Is it some sort of a TS error? No, so TS ignore basically means ke tell TypeScript ke bhai ignore this line. I know there is an error here, but I as the application developer understand. For example, whatever, let's say the input here is username and password, which means let's take an easier, simpler example. Create context needs to return, what example can we take? Let's say there's a number. Let x : number equal to 1. This will TypeScript will complain. Okay, bhai, you are trying to assign a string to a number. Whenever you see something like this and you're like, it's fine, I want this to, I know this is incorrect, but I still want TypeScript to not fail. you can type tsignore and the error sort of goes away. This is very bad practice and you shouldn't do this ever. And any code base where you see this, you should sort of fix this and find the actual underlying issue. But a lot of time it's like, jaldi jaldi mein we have to complete this tonight and I don't know how to fix this type error, and maybe there's a reason that there is this type error, and so people add this and then sort of works. So that's what tsignore does. It's very bad practice and you shouldn't use it in production ever. Can you explain how to return via promisifying? So let's do that one more time. How do you promisify function is a better question. If there is a JWT verify function which only supports, takes a token as a string and takes a callback function as a string, and what does it do? It does something with the token, let's say logs it, actually does verification, but let's say it just logs it, and rather than returning whatever a user ID, what does it do? It calls callback with the user ID. Why, Harkirat? Why does it not simply return a user ID? The answer is the token verification could take some time. It might be कि हाँ भाई token verification in itself requires some internal verify function which again takes an argument as input, and it takes a call, is a callback function, returns you something, and then you finally have to call callback of 1 here. So these asynchronous functions are a little weird, and the one way they work is कि हाँ, you tell whoever is calling it कि bro, pass me a third method as an argument. I will call this method whenever I have access to your data. It might not happen immediately. If it was happening immediately, there was no need to do this. We could have simply done let user ID equal to jw.verify. But jw.verify function takes some time. It is an asynchronous function, which is why this function says कि bro, I will give me a third function as an argument. Whenever I have access to your JWT key, I will call your function and you will have access to your user. All right. The problem is this was not the best pattern. This did something called क्या कहते हैं उसको, callback hell ही कहते हैं ना, callback hell, which was कि हाँ, this one function which let's say calls another jwt.verify2 function which passes whatever user as an input and then gets another callback function, and this cycle kept on repeating. This was slightly ugly, which is why promises came into the picture, where you would, the equivalent of this in promises would be jwt.verify, let x equal to jwt.verify, and then let y equal to await, sorry await होगा यहाँ पे, await jwt.verify2. So this sort of looks much cleaner than this, and the way to achieve this is by if this function returns a promise. Now this jw.verify unfortunately does not return a promise, so you have to sort of promisify it. Question is, how do you promisify it? And that the short answer here is कि हाँ, whatever this function is that used to call a callback, or more specifically maybe whatever is this function that you know you will get access to your final thing here in this callback, you wrap that around a promise, which means you say bhai, I return a promise, which means I will tell you in the future when I have access to your data. And how do you tell it? Earlier you used to tell it by calling the callback function. When you're using promises, you do it by calling the resolve function. Resolve with whatever data you want to return. Whoever is calling this function will get a promise. If they await the promise, which means they wait for it to return, or which means they do await and then call the function which is returning the promise, only when this resolve gets called does this await succeed, and whatever this promise resolve function has inside do you get access to here in the x variable. All right, this is a short explanation of how to promisify an archaic callback function. What do you mean by archaic? Basically the way that callback functions, the asynchronous functions used to be written before promises came into the picture. But let's call it, let's do a big pause here and then proceed and understand the things from today, and then I'm happy to discuss promisifying again. Although if 80% of the class understands it, go back to this video, you should be able to understand it eventually. All right, let's get back to our to-do application. Let's go to the server, and now let's start to explore our routes. We understand index.ts file completely now, hopefully. Okay, if auth header you do this, else you return this, and in case the auth header is correct, you get access to the user ID as well. Question is, how do you get access to this context? And the answer is, if you go to any of these routes, for example, the user routes, let's look at the sign up function. It has expects a username and a password as an input, gets username and password. What does it do here? ops.context.db.user. So that is where that user is being used here. Again, you could totally import user here from whatever ./db. This works as well, and you can simply call user.insert money. It will have zero effect on your final logic. The reason you do it this way is so that whenever you have whenever you write tests in the future, you can simply call this sign up with a mocked user variable in the context. That way you don't create an actual database when you're writing tests. All right. But since right now this is a real application, we actually insert this into the database. You should ideally have a check here. Okay, if user already exists, then return XYZ. But we have some we haven't written that logic. We simply put the data in the database. We get back the user ID from this response. We create the token by doing jwd.sign. Now notice jwd.sign is not asynchronous. Signing happens immediately, which is why here you can simply do this and you don't have to do all the callback wali cheese, the thing that we did in the last part. If this was also an asynchronous function, this also had a callback at the end, you would have had to promissify this as well. But luckily jwd.sign is already a synchronous function, which is why you can simply get its value here and return. That's what sign up does here. Is the sign up procedure clear? Very similar to the app.post sign up we did in week 8. Like the logic at least is the same, only where you're getting user from is a little different. This user from, everything else hopefully straightforward. All right. आंखें तरस गई थी 97% को देखने को. Sign up is done. Login, straightforward, similar. User ID password requested as the input. Find by ID, find this user in the database. ops.ctx.user ID. Finally, here is where we use the user ID that we extracted with so much mehnat. But is that correct? That is actually incorrect. You have to actually find by email here. So this is actually the right thing. When a person signs in, they are not expected to be logged in already, which is why you will do something like this. ops.input.username. Let me push this fix because this was incorrect. You can also make this change on your side, but the sign in or the login function needs to do what? It needs to check if this user exists in the database. A user with this email exists. If doesn't exist, then say unauthorized. I don't know who you are. If they do exist, then create the token for them and then return the token. Lastly, the me endpoint is where we will finally use this user ID. What does the me endpoint do? Also notice this. We will come to what this is, but this is what the middleware part is. Public procedure dot no inputs does have an output. It returns an email which is a string. You don't have to have outputs, but good to have. We will see later. It gives you some, helps you a little when you're writing front end code. So we have explicitly defined that this will also give you what? An email as the response. Now usually the me endpoint returns all your metadata, your avatar information, your first name, your last name. We're not storing any of that here, but if you did, you would return all of this from there. We just return the email for now. What does this do? Here, context.db.user. Find by ID. Where does the ID come from? Here is where we use the user ID for the very first time. We know whoever is calling this function, this is that user's ID. Why? Because this is what was put in the context. Where was this put in the context? Here in this function. How was this specific user ID extracted? It was extracted from the user's header. So you know for sure this user ID is the ID for the user. And then you can simply check if the response doesn't exist, which means this user does not exist, which basically shouldn't happen. If the control has reached up until this point, it means this is a user that actually exists in your database and has signed in the past, which means the control will never reach here. But just for some type safety, I added this not response check, and finally I returned email, which is response.username or string, which also should never happen. Response.username should always exist. These three endpoints, the login endpoint, the me endpoint, and the sign up endpoint, are these clear? Can we proceed to the to do endpoints, which also should be straightforward, and then we will understand middlewares a little bit. Good to go. To do endpoint, again straightforward. If you understand this, you will understand this very well as well. To do create endpoint, again uses something. We will see what this is and how middlewares are created. Dot mutation, because you're trying to create a to do. What do we do? We get the save, we get the title, we get the description. We create a new to do and then we save it. This is how we did it in the post call in our Express backend to do server as well. And then simply return the ID of the specific to do that was created. And to do get needs to get all the to dos for this user. So here also we use the user ID thing, the ops.context.user ID. When we do await dot to do dot find all the to dos for this user ID and then return, we iterate over all the to dos and return just the title, description and done, because like the to dos you get here has a bunch of things. This is like a big document object. What we want to return is just an array of whatever title, description and string, so that the type of this thing is limited to just title, description and done, and maybe ID if you want it, and doesn't have like all the things that this guy has, because this guy has like a bunch of, if you look at the type, it's a little more complicated than a simple title, description and done, which is why I map this from this to this and convert to dos from this to this. If this map function feels weird, you can also just create a simple to do final to dos variable here, iterate over all the to dos, push to do, you get the idea, push to final to dos and then return final to dos. You can also do this, but this is a cleaner way to do it, which is iterate over all the to dos and map them to title, description and done, rather than returning the whole thing that this to dos object gets, because this gets it from dot find, which gets a bunch of things other than just these three keys. Is this part clear? If not, it is, then we can move to middlewares. Cool. So lastly, very subtle difference between context and middleware. Interview question, if someone asks, what is context? It is used to extract a lot of information from the request. What is middleware? It is used to stop a request from reaching here if certain conditions aren't met. If I go back to our slides, you will see in middlewares, they say that authorization can be done in two ways. Authorize using the resolver or authorize using middleware. If these come from the Trpc docs. What does authorize using resolver mean? It means if there is an endpoint, if I remove this dot use here, this endpoint we know should only be accessible to people who have been logged in, and you can simply do ops.ctx.userid. If it doesn't exist, return. So you can do this, but what's the other way to do it? Authorize using middleware, which means don't do this here, do this in a middleware. The syntax to do it is called .use whatever your middleware is. What is this middleware function? It is similar to the middleware function we've done until in week 8 and many times now, which is a function. How do you give a middleware to a route in Express? You give it by calling it here before the final function, or like putting it here. How do you do it in Trpc? In your procedure you call .use is logged in. Question is, what does is logged in look like? Very similar to our middleware here in week 8, which is it has access to context as well. So first the context, create context function gets called, then your middleware gets called, then your final function gets called. If the middleware says it should be called, gets access to the context. If userid doesn't exist, throws a new error, which means it stops right here, the control stops right here. And then if the user does exist, you can either simply call ctx.next, that also works, or you can do some extra things. For example, let me get all the information for this user from the database, and you can put that in the context as well. If you do, if you don't want to complicate it, feel free to just call ops.next and you're good to go, which is similar to us calling next here in index.ts. Middleware / index.ts. We did our verification and simply called next. In Trpc, the verification and extracting the user ID is done in context. The blocking is done here in middlewares. We have written one middleware. We can also write another middleware that, let's say, only lets admins get in. So what will that do? That will first get the user ID, check the user ID exists. If it doesn't exist, throw. Then hit the database, get back whether or not this user is the admin. Let's say there's an admin table where we store their details, and only if the user.admin will it call ops.next. Else what will it do? It'll whatever throw a new error. So that's what a middleware is, and that is what how it's different from context, which is a middleware blocks the request. A context never blocks the request. You can do authorization by having authorization here in the final resolver, or what is good practice, define this resolution logic separately and then simply use this middleware everywhere. For example, here we used it in the to do get function. We will, what other endpoint do you think requires this? The me endpoint. Me endpoint only works for someone who's logged in. If they're not logged in, they don't need the /me endpoint. So this is the other endpoint where we sort of call .use is looked in, and things are good. All right. Is this thing clear? Can we proceed to React? %, which is good, 1% less than I was hoping for. Open chat for like just 1 minute. Quickly tell me what's .next CTX user. Someone said, Harkiyat, what had you done before? Which is this. And the answer is, these middlewares are sort of, they let you extracted the user details there. If you want to put more things in the context, you can here. If I do call this, and if I go to, which means I say, ke bhai, options have the existing context plus add this user context there. So you have slightly more context or things to work with than you originally got from the create context function. If you do this, the thing that I've done here, you will have access to this user variable where in all your final routes. So if I go to my final route, I can actually do ops.ctx.user. As you can see, the property user does exist and it is of any type, and the reason for that is, okay, this sort of has an any type. If find one function gave me good types, which Prisma does, then this user variable over here also would have the right types, and you can basically decorate your context with more data. And if you're calling, if you have like is logged in as the middleware here, you will also get the right types. Okay, ops.context. You will have access to the user argument here. The more you decorate this context here, the more access you will have there. So every middleware can put more data in the context if need be. You might say, Harkirat, then what is the need of create context function? Why can't we do everything in the middleware? I would say yes, you're right. I guess the big reason is if you're defining 3 different middlewares, all those middlewares have access to the user ID variable if you define the user ID variable in the create context function rather than having various middlewares. All right. So this is how you define a middleware. If you look at just the logic, very similar to the middlewares in Express. Only in Express we used to do the logic to verify the token. Right now we're doing the verification logic where in the create context function, and here we simply do the checking whether or not the user ID exists. If it does not, we block, else we let through. That's the high level. Let's proceed a little. 1 second, please. Okay, cool. So let's do the React bit and then happy to take questions. Let's at least try to complete React, and then most probably I feel like next might be an offline video. You have your server. You can create a client file. You get very nice types, and you can do whatever. User dot login. I can do me. I can do sign up. I can do, if I do sign up dot mutate, and I call this function, this will actually send the request. This is something we did yesterday. If I do let me just do a hard reset to revert all the changes. If I do a tsc-b, if I start the server locally, this starts the server locally. If I also start the client locally, which is node dist client index.js, it will send the request, and now it gets an error because a user with this entry already exists in the database, I'm assuming. So if I call this, if I do tsc-b again and call this again, I still get an error. Unauthorized. Let's see the sign up function. Cert many. Bounty khol de. Bounty $40, $50 bounty. I'm sure I'm missing something very obvious here. So can you guys tell me what I am missing? If you guys already know, putting the chat. Why is the client not able to hit? Authorization bearer 1. Ah, you are right. Most probably. Let's see. So I have the hard coded header here. Probably not, but let's see. Let's build it again, and let's send the request on the client again. Yeah, that's not it. How do I get the? Oh, sorry, I removed it from the wrong file. Is it? No, it's the right file. Any other suggestions as to what might be wrong here? Does it run for you guys locally? I'm assuming not. Chat is open if anyone can figure this out, which is. No, I don't think that's it. Rerun the server. I did run the server. Let's run the client again. Save all files. Oh, okay. I think. Let me remove everything. Let me do a git reset -- hard. Let me remove dist. Let me do tsc-b again. Server. Client. Nope. I do see a JWT being logged somehow. Week 14. Does it run on your? Is anyone else coding along? I don't think experimental is it. No, don't worry about that. Warning. Where does this JWT log come from? I got a 401. Everyone's getting a 401, right? It could be that the database is down. That is most probably my guess at this moment. Okay. If you go to index.ts, this MongoDB database might be down. You have to send a token for to do create. Oh, am I calling to do create? No, I'm calling. Oh, sir, you might have done it, Kalyan. Yeah, I think so. I just wanted to show this. The other one won't work because we're not sending any right JWTs. So yeah, it was just that the error was in this line and not in this line. And Kalyan, I think most probably you won the bounty. Let's see. Yeah, so that was it. Congratulations, Kalyan. Thank you. So this is how you can call functions in this Node.js client that we have written. Again, you can call the other function as well. This was throwing an error because there is no right JWT here. This is an incorrect JWT. So it is supposed to throw an error, right? It is supposed to throw a 401 because the JWT here is incorrect. And this one does not throw an error because this does not require a JWT to be there. But this one, the control finally reaches the is logged in middleware, and that guy throws an error, which is why sort of this thing was failing. This thing works. But the thing that I wanted to tell was, this is how you create a client. You get very nice types, so on and so forth. This is what Trpc gives you. Question is, how do you integrate it with React? So let's understand that next. Yeah, I think you guys would clone it locally, and if you have, please run it locally as well. So the next steps are React. The way to add React to such a project now is, number one, initialize the React project. So all I did was I called whatever npm create wheat at latest, pressed enter, and then went through the whole flow, selected React, TypeScript, all that jazz, and then I had an empty React project cloned here. Again, this might feel a little weird, and this gets slightly easier or like cleaner when you move to a monorepo. But at the top we have a package.json, which sort of governs the client folder and the server folder. More importantly, just the server folder. And here inside this we have a React which has its own package.json. So we have like a package inside a package, which is a little weird and doesn't happen when you have a monorepo. Will happen right now. Does not happen in Next because Next has all the backend and the front end here. But for React, the backend is outside right now and the front end is in this React folder. All right. Now, if you want this to work, you have to make sure your TypeScript compiler does not compile the React folder, for which you have to go to tsconfig.json and exclude React. And if you later when you do Next, exclude this as well. Else when you run tsc-b, it will try to compile everything in the React folder, and that sort of requires some extra plugins. It will not work with this very basic tsconfig.json, which is why I simply excluded React. If I let React be, you can also like have them side by side. In the end, React needs to import the type that the server exports, which is why they need to be close by, but they don't have to reside one inside the other. They can be side by side as well. For now, I just kept one inside the other. All right. What's step 2? Update tsconfig to exclude React folder. Done. Add dependencies. So from here again, I went to the trpc docs and I went to client usage, and here the first thing it said is React query integration. So first question is why React query integration? Why not React integration? The answer is okay, the library that these guys have created, the trpc folks have created, that let you do basically this thing. This is how we were using the client in a basic Node.js backend, which is like at trp/client, to do the same thing in React and get very nice what are called hooks for your data. They use another library called React Query. So React Query is a very popular library that lets you basically fetch data from the backend and get that data in very nice hooks. What does that mean? Do you guys remember this library I told you about, SWR? What does it say? React hooks for data fetching. What does this mean? This is a library similar to React Query. What do both of these libraries let you do? They let you do one thing. Okay, how have we been fetching data until now? If I go to a React component, the way we used to fetch data until now was function app, let's say. We used to write whatever const data comma set data equal to use state null undefined whatever. Then we had an effect here which would call the fetch, and then whenever you got the data, you would finally call set data with the response from the fetch or the Axios. Do we remember this? How we used to fetch data using a use effect and store it in this data variable? This weird way for us to fetch data and put it here. Whenever we've written front ends until now for a to-do application, course selling application, do we understand this part? All right, great. What these guys said was both use SWR and React Query. This is very ugly. Simply do this. Use SWR localhost :3000 / whatever to do, and then simply use this data. So something like this. Let data equal to use SWR, the endpoint you want to hit that gives you the data, and I will give you access to the data here. You don't have to do the whole use the use effect and do this. The problem is, of course, this data is sort of asynchronous, doesn't come immediately, so it usually gives you access to two things here. If a loading variable, if data.loading, then you can return whatever div loading or a spinner or loading ... And then if the data.loading is not true, then you get access to the actual data from this endpoint in a, this might feel weird, data.data variable. I would rather call this like to-dos. So if to-dos.loading, then return this, else return this. This is what, as you can see, use SWR, which is React hooks. What is a hook? This is a hook. Use state is a hook. Use effect is a hook. React hooks for data fetching, which means you can fetch your data, give it the right where to fetch it from. It will give you a hook for that data. And if you might remember, we actually wrote a use to-dos hook ourselves, which had like whatever to-dos comma set to-dos equal to use state here, and then had the use effect, and then use to return the to-dos. If you remember this, we've done this once, although a lot of people did not understand it. Just like we wrote a use to-dos hook, use SWR gives you hooks that let you fetch data so that you don't have to do that ugly logic of calling fetch. Similar to this is the React query library, which lets you do almost the same thing, which is get data in a very clean fashion. It also does a bunch of other things. This will every 5 seconds refresh data. This will, anytime you change tab and come back to a tab, it will resend the request and in the background refresh the data. So these do a bunch of things. If the request fails, it sends it again 3 times and only then does it say that the request has failed. Otherwise, to-dos.loading sort of keeps on loading until it keeps on retrying your request. So these libraries do a bunch of extra things that make it very easy for you as the application developer to get access to your final data from these hooks. From a high level, do we understand why React query was introduced, what used SWR and what it lets you do? Alright, great. On top of this, these guys wrote, Trpc wale, they said React query integration. Trpc offers a first class integration with React. What does first class integration mean? It means we've written a library, you can use it as such. Under the hood, this is simply a wrapper around the popular React query library. So they simply took that library, wrote some logic on top of it, and then now are able to give you hooks similar to this, so that your life is very easy. You can simply call some hooks and get access to your data. Alright, let's see how it does that. The Trpc React query integration. Let's say this is your index page or whatever, your landing page, your courses page. What can you do? You can say const whatever query, hello query, to-dos query, user query, trpc dot wherever your sort of function lies in the router hierarchy, trpc dot user dot sign up or trpc dot user dot me dot use query, and passing your arguments, and you have access to hello query which has your data. Similarly, for a mutation, you get access to the mutation like trpc dot whatever your mutation is in the hierarchy dot use mutation, and then you can call goodbye mutation dot mutate, and when you call this, it actually updates the data. Is this part clear? How given trpc and given your trpc file, we'll see how this file is created, but given this file, how you can simply call this and have access to the data here in a hook, rather than you getting data similar to this and then calling use effect and then storing the data in React query. Rather than doing all of that, it's sort of cool. Okay, you have access to this data via a hook. Is this part clear? How you can fetch the data? If it is, then we can look at the to-do application that I've created. This part is a little weird. I agree. Let's look at how I've created the to-do application, and then hopefully this might be a little more clearer, might not be. Let's do that, and then we can come back to this file. Let's look at the React code. Back to the slides. You also have to enable CORS for this to work, because your React will run on one port, your backend will run on another port. The way to enable CORS is basically mentioned here, and it's very straightforward. It is similar to how we did it in Express, which is you go, CORS is always enabled on the backend. So if you go to your backend code, which is server/index.ts, you will see I import CORS here. This is the same CORS library, and in my final the server function I called middleware CORS. This middleware is not similar to the other middlewares we have created for procedures. This is a global high-level middleware that we create on this server. In Next.js, it will be slightly different how you added. In AWS Lambda, it will be different. In case of the standalone adapter, this is how you add the CORS middleware. Why do we need it? Because backend and frontend are running on different ports, and by default, CORS is not enabled on TRPC. All right. After you've done this high-level overview of React query, if you've done that, let's go chhod do integration in React. So let's go to how you integrate an existing TRPC backend to React. The answer is, if you go to the React code, other than the app.tsx file, let's look at the app.tsx file. Let me remove this thing that I added. Should be another. You add, first thing you do is you add a utils/trpc.ts file. You can add it wherever. You don't have to add it to utils.trpc. What does this do? It gets access to the type from this server. Again, if you remember from yesterday, this is the most important type that it exports. This is how our vanilla frontend that we wrote here also imports this, and this is how it gets the right type here. When I type .user. It gives me login, me, and sign up. How does it know? Okay, login, me, and sign up are 3 keys here from this type, because this type is inferred from this app router. So this is always used in any client that you introduce. Now we're introducing a React client. If I go back to react/utils/trpc.ts, it gets access to that app router and simply exports a variable called trpc, which is create trpc react, and passes app router as a generic. This part is similar to this part, only we haven't yet mentioned this URL and everything, which we mention where in app.tsx. So if you go to app.tsx, you will see at the very top we add another thing. So we add 2 things, but let's not look at them here. Let's look at them in the trpc docs. When you go to React query integration, so I am a new developer, I have a React app, I have a trpc backend, I want to include my trpc backend in my React application. What will I do? I will come to this page. What does this say? Yeah, this is the usage for it, but let's ignore that. Let's look at how you set this up. So if you click on React query integration and setup, it will give you all the steps to do it. What is step 1? Import all of these libraries. So do an npm install of all of these libraries in your React application. I've already done it. If you have a fresh vanilla React application, let's create a fresh vanilla application so I can show you each and every step. Maybe that makes things slightly easier. So let me do Vite npm create Vite at latest. Let's call it React 2. Let's call it in the React framework in TypeScript. Let me go here and let me npm install all the libraries it has asked us to, along with like whatever the default libraries here. Everything is installed. Next thing it says, import your app router. Where? In the utils/trpc.ts file. So that's how I got this code. In my React 2 folder, I create a new utils folder. In my utils folder, I create a trpc.ts file and I paste these 3 lines. I have to make sure app router comes from the right folder, which in my case is // no. Yeah, this looks right. 3 dots and then server, which is this trpc server file. This still gives me an error. Did I not install? Oh, sorry. I did not install all the right dependencies in the right folder. I have to go to the React 2 folder and then install all the right dependencies. Once that succeeds, this error should go away. What is the next step? It says add the trpc provider. So this is an important thing you need to understand. What does adding a provider mean? If you remember the context class we did a few weeks ago, you can create these things called contexts in React, which let you propagate data through components without prop drilling, which means you don't have to pass a prop explicitly to components. Any prop that's present in some high level context, every child component or grandchild or grandchild will have access to it. Whenever you introduce these new libraries, a lot of libraries will want you to, just like recoil, if you might remember, at the very top we used to do recoil route. Similarly, both trpc and this query client provider, which comes from where? Which comes from the React query library, need to wrap your application similar to recoil route, which is what this file sort of suggests. Okay, bro, whenever you're creating your original top level React file, do 2 things. Add the trpc provider, add the query client provider, similar to how we used to add recoil route when we added recoil as our state management library. Only all the components that are defined here would have access to recoil. Similarly, only the components that are defined here will have access to these hooks that we want to use eventually. That's why this is step 3. Okay, in your app, you replace everything with this. What extra does it do? It creates a create client function which is nothing but a new query client. It happens inside the use state, but that's to make sure there are re-renders. You don't recreate this query client. If you don't understand this, feel free to ignore. And same thing for Trpc client. We create a Trpc client which actually points to the right URL. This is where my backend is hosted. And in case you need to send headers, which we will need to because we are creating a to-do application, pass the headers here. This headers part and this URL part is the same as in our vanilla client. This URL and this headers part. The syntax is slightly different, but these lines, this is what they do, which is they give the Trpc URL backend server URL and the set of headers, which in our case will be the local storage token, and put them in every request that's going out. Let me just copy this part and let me paste this in react2/app.tsx. Now this returns for app by default, which is why when I put it here, I'm also going to export it by default. Everything else is the same. Let me remove this get auth cookie. This will actually be something like this: bearer space local storage dot get item token. Hopefully this part is clear because that is where we'll be finally storing our JWT. And hopefully everything else seems clear now. Let me just type hi there here. I've not yet used any hooks. I've not yet connected to the Trpc backend. I've only done the steps that they've asked me to do until now. Is this part clear? How you start to integrate React to your application. I've just followed the docs. Nothing too fancy, hopefully. All right, great. Next step is how you actually add components and find the data from your backend. Let's say I want to create a new component called to-dos or sign up. I define a sign up component here. Again, I can define it in a different file if need be. I'm defining it in the same one. Let's say this returns whatever div sign up. All right, looks decent. If I run yarn dev here, what will I see? I will simply see a sign up. Yeah, I see sign up here. It's styled a little because of the default styles, but all I see is a sign up text here. If I add something here, I see that extra thing here. Question is, how do I mutate data? How do I get data? And the answer next is, again, I will go through the docs and what do they say? Okay, now I can simply use whatever queries I want. I can simply get whatever mutations I want. So let me copy these two things, paste them here and see how we can use it. Const user query equal to trpc dot kya hona chahiye? What's the key? User dot what me dot use query. Doesn't need to send anything in. This thing will return me the response from the me endpoint or like the me function. And let's say I want to create a to-do. So to-do create will be trpc dot, again it's giving me full auto completion here, which is sort of their pitch, but use mutation. This is how I can get access to this query and this mutation. How do I use this? It's fairly straightforward. User query, so you can get access to const data equal to user query dot data dot whatever email is the thing that it returns right now. But if you return first name, last name, whatever, this is how you get access to it. If I hover over this, there is some error. Data is possibly undefined. So data may or may not exist. If this endpoint fails, then data will not return anything, which is why it said data may or may not exist. So question mark dot basically means it's called optional chaining. If it does exist, find the email. If it doesn't exist, then return undefined. You can also simply do let if user query dot data, only then do let email equal to whatever, and then you won't get the TypeScript error. All right, this is how I can access data from the me endpoint. And to create something, I can simply call whatever button on create to do. Of course, there'll be input boxes above. On click equal to do create dot mutate, and then pass the right arguments here, which will be like the title, description. That's it. All right. So this is how you call mutations and get queries from the backend. There are some extra things that we need to discuss, but at a high level, this is how you can get access to or like interact with your backend. Why is this cool? This is cool because you simply have to call trpc.user.me.useQuery rather than going if you were using an HTTP server, you'd have to do a fetch, all that jazz. Here you don't have to do that, and trpc gives you like very nice hooks on the front end you can simply use and create a to-do application of your own. How clear is this? Is this good enough, bad enough? How are we doing? It's clear? Oh wow, pretty good. Okay, cool. So in that case, all you have to do is look at the to-do application next. I created a very basic to-do application. One thing you should know is React query resends requests if they fail, and you can disable this behavior by doing this thing. When I created the query client from React query, so this is my original React application which has my to-do application code. You can pass an option here that says refetch on window focus false. What this will do is what trpc does is if I ever go back to a window, let's say I was here, I came back here, it resends all the requests. I have disabled this feature. Why? Because the database that we're using is very slow. It's the cloud database that I've created and a bunch of people put data there, so it's very slow right now. So, and what trpc or sorry use query does is, or React query does is, if the first time the request fails, it sends it again. If second time it fails, it sends it again. If I go and come here, it sends it again. And I wanted to disable this behavior. Otherwise, you will see like loading here for a really long time. That's the only reason I added this part. If you did not get it, it's fine. If you have a good database, it wouldn't even matter. All right. Let's look at the code. Top level app has that trpc client creation. One thing you'll notice is it is present. It points to what? Localhost :3000, which is our backend where I'm running my trpc backend. This server right here. Headers, it gets it from local storage and then does the provider 1, provider 2 index page. What does the index page look like? It says user query gets trpc.user.me.useQuery. To do mutate, it lets you mutate a to do query that lets you get all the to-dos from the backend. Iske baad, there is one sort of new concept which is use SWR, React query. All these libraries, as I said, these won't immediately return. So they give you access to a .isLoading key, which basically means that this data is still coming from the backend. An equivalent of this in the fetch world would be if you had an index page, const data set data equal to whatever use state empty array, let's call it to-dos. If you had a simple Express backend and you were not using any of these fancy libraries, this is how we did things, right? Await axios.get whatever, let response equal to this, and then we did set to-dos response. This takes some time. This request takes some time to proceed. If await works here, it does not, but if it did, this request takes some time. You can't put await inside a use effect. You have to create an async function and then call it. We've discussed this before, but assume it did. During that time that the backend request is succeeding, you want to show like a loader or you want to show loading. The way to achieve that is you add another hook, another state variable here called loading, and you do something like this. Okay, initially loading is true, and then whenever this succeeds, we make loading as false. And here we put a check. If loading is true, then we return a loading or a spinner on our website or whatever. Else we return our actual sort of iterate over all the to-dos and render them. So this is how we did it, or how I would create something like this. When the data is getting fetched, the user sees a loader, and when it gets fetched, they see the to-do. Equivalent of this in use SWR or the React query library that we're using is this will give you a is loading key. When that is true, it means data is being loaded. So just show to your user loading. Whenever the me endpoint is giving you back data, why do you need this endpoint? You need this because you want to show the app bar pay logout buttons on the top right. You want to understand whether or not to take the person to the sign up page. So you need this to succeed. Only then do you want to render something. During that time, you show a loader. Similarly, when you are getting to-dos from the backend, you can be like, you can actually check that. You probably don't need to check to-dos, because to-dos only exist for us if the person is logged in. This you definitely need to check and like show a loader on the screen when the user is loading. User query.isError. This means if this query failed, when will this query fail? This query will fail if the backend tells you you are not logged in. The me endpoint expects you to be logged in. We have a middleware that will throw an error anytime the right JWT does not reach the server. If an error is thrown in this world, a lot of bad things would happen. So usually you put this inside a try catch. You put this inside a try catch. If this request did fail, then you either set to-dos to whatever, an empty array, or usually what you do is you set error and then you have another variable here called error. And if this request did fail for whatever reason, you set error to be true, and then after loading you have another check if is error. Then you show to the user ke sorry, an internal error appeared or whatever. Okay, you are not logged in or whatever. If this request fails, you put it inside a try catch. What is this try catch? Basically, if an error is thrown here, control reaches here. A few of you might already know this, few of you might not. Very common concept across languages. If any error is thrown here, then control will simply reach here, and here you can say set error to true, which would mean this state variable becomes true, and then this is what the user sees. The equivalent of this in this library is user query. If it threw an error, then is error will be true, and you can show the user the sign up page, because you know the user has not sent the right token, so they need to see the sign up page. However, if this does not fail, which means it succeeded correctly, you get back the user's email. You can simply render the user's email by user query.data.email, and then you can also render all of their to-dos by to-do query.data.whatever. You might ask, Sarkir, why am I not doing if to-do query.isError here? The answer is, if the user is not logged in, then both of these will fail, so one check is good enough. If the user is logged in, then none of these will fail, so one check is all you need. Falling in love with me, but one check is all you need. You don't need two checks. And similarly, if you get access to the data, you can simply do to-do query.data.whatever and then user query.data.whatever. So is this part clear? How you render this? Let me actually just run this locally and show you what the to-do application looks like. You have to start the backend server as well and start the client. And if I go here, you see loading initially. You will see it takes a lot of time, and that is because my MongoDB server is sort of the common server. So it's like very slow. After it does succeed, as you can see, the user is not logged in right now. The token they're sending is not correct. So I get to the sign up page. I log this in. I click on sign up, and then the page refreshes because I reach the to-do page. Why does the page refresh? If you look at the sign up route, you will see I have two input boxes, and then I called user sign up mutate.mutate. Where does user sign up mutate come from? Here. And this is slightly weird of a syntax. You don't lose something like this. Let response equal to await user sign up mutate.mutate. What you do is you call this, and then when you had defined user sign up mutate, you pass in on success as a function. If this mutation did succeed ever, this control gets logged. And what do I do here? I store the token in the local storage. I also called window.location equal to /, which means I refresh the page. This page refreshes the next time the control reaches index page. Index page. You have some right tokens in your local storage, which is why this succeeds, and you get back hi. And I see no email here, which does not look right. Let's see, network. I think we have another bounty at our hands, unless I figure this out. No, I can't figure this out. I figured it out, unfortunately. So the issue was what we're storing in the database is, if you look at the sign up route, What we're storing in the database is, well, username and password. And what are we accessing here? We are accessing username here. So what's the issue? You guys will tell and win a $50 bounty. Chat is open. The problem is, let me just confirm I'm running the same code as you guys. So let me hard reset the project. I'm running React, yarn dev. I'm running the Trpc backend server, tsc-b, and then, make sure. Let me just remove React 2. I don't think React 2 is the error, but we'll see. Node index.js, refresh, loading, and then I see hi, even though I should see hi email, and I get like an empty email back, and I get another email which is an array. No, that is not it. I should basically get hi my email here. I'm getting just hi here, and if you look at the request, Trpc is not returning email. But why? It's the same code as on the website, so it's the same code as on here that I'm running locally. So you guys should probably see the same thing locally. Change username to email because, so it's username in the DB. I checked that because of slash in the server. Where is or slash? What line number? We are not requesting email. I think we are because of context or middleware. Or Nihai, give me concrete answer. This is like an open source contribution. Set this up locally, find the same error, like try to do it locally, and then find an answer and give me. I will increase the bounty. $100. Up to kar do. $100 bounty, but do it correctly. No, that is incorrect. It does not reset the state. $100 bounty. What is the error? Okay, I'll tell you what the error is. You have to tell me the exact solution in a very long message. Don't write random things. The problem is, whatever is the project that I've posted here, week 14, if I start the React front end, if I start the Trpc backend, what happens is, ideally, I should see hi space email here because I am getting access to email here. I do a trpc.user.me.use query, but user query dot data dot email does not exist, even though this guy, if you look at it, gets response from the database and then returns an email here, but I'm not getting it. In the backend, it is stored as username, but you are accessing as email in the client. No, but I'm returning as email here. So response.user to response.email. Where? Here? Really? I don't think that's it, but let me try, because I'm storing it in the database as username. And so if oh wait. Yeah, so username is right. It should be username here. It shouldn't be email, because that's how I store it in the database. See, this is how I store it in the database. This is how I should access it here. So think about it. There's like standard debugging techniques here, right? You have to put logs here and figure it out. Maybe check the database. You guys all have access to the database. Figure it out. मैं बैठा हूँ. Someone await in front end. Give me like very detailed, this line number pe change this. Why do you always send tokens in sign up? Ideally, it should only be sent in logged in. We send token always, and that happens in Express. Well, not exactly. Yeah, we globally set a token and we send it when we are using TRPC. The user should not reach the sign up page at all. If they're already logged in, they should not reach the sign in page at all. So they should never be able to hit the sign up or the sign in endpoints. Current code is the same as on the web, on the repo, which is this thing right here. It's in 100x devs-hkirat/week 14. So here is where the code is. I think I'm running the same code. Let me confirm this a third time. Hard reset. Let me also push in case I'm not. Do you guys also see the same thing locally, or do you guys see something else? किसने setup भी किया locally अभी तक? So I have the same code running, same thing locally, right? Okay, so everyone sees the same thing. So it shouldn't be too difficult to debug. They're like standard things you have to do, put logs somewhere and debug it. We have a await while our user is saving the database and then get it from the database, asynchronous. We have an await when we have an await while our user is saving in the database. That is correct. And then get it from the database, asynchronous JavaScript. Sorry, Lavish, I did not understand what you're saying. Okay, only 5 more minutes and then I'll solve it myself. So you guys have 5 minutes to fix it. Come on. Here is what I would do. I would put log in user yours too. Okay, someone posted something very big. Karthik Sharma. This looks the same as the thing I had. This looks exactly the same. Oh, someone sent something which might be right, I think. In db/index.tx line 17. db/index.ts line 17. Ah, you got it, sir. Most probably Karan got it. Let's see. So this I wrote at the very last second. This should be mongoose.models.user and not. Although this might not be it because this only runs if you hot reload. This might not fix it. This may fix it as well because this is something I wrote at the very end before the class began. So let's see, Karan, if you're right. Oh, the fuck. Oh, sorry, wrong folder. tsc-b node. This get the backend started. Right, moment of truth. Nope, did not fix it, sir. Okay, let me just pause chat for a bit. A few people have. Let me look at Karan's message. Line 17. Oh shoot, you're right. Line 17. Karan is still right. I am the one who messed up here. So let's do that one more time. Actually, this might be it. This might be it. Unauthorized, which basically means I should see a sign up page here. All right. Okay, there you go. Congratulations, Karan. This is a change I made at the very end because Next.js sort of complains unless you do this extra thing. This was the original code. And when I was making that change, I had to do here even though it should be user. So, good one. Karan, would you like to explain your debugging technique? Just post it in chat. I wish I could bring you up here. Let me check if I can actually. But this is great. This is more or less what open source is. Only you don't see immediate motivation कि हाँ $100 मिलेंगे. You have to stick through it, but it's just debugging a lot of these weird issues and helping the maintainers out. For example, Karan helped me out today. Otherwise, it would have taken me some time and the class flow would have broken. He helped me out. He won $100. That's usually what happens in open source. Only it's like longer durations. You have to do this repeatedly for 10 days. I'll tell you a weird fact. The day I got a call from like the backpack team is the day I thought कि अब मैं contribute नहीं कर रहा, because for 10 days I was contributing very aggressively and like not sleeping, and I had a full-time job. So I had resigned from my job but I had like a notice period. तो उन 10 days में I was contributing there, basically not sleeping. सुबह से रात तक I was contributing, and last day I was like अब 10 दिन हो गए and he's not reaching out or no one's reaching out, so I'll stop now. And that day only he reached out. तो इतना random होता है वो. You just have to stick through it and keep doing things. So congrats to Karan. And yes, this is your to-do application code. Now if I create a to-do, this button, if you look at it, the code, if you look at it, it sends the mutation to the backend. You can find the code in the backend, and as you can see, I can keep adding to-dos here, and your integration is sort of complete. That's the React integration. Next integration is slightly harder. You have to change the backend and the front end, both the things. So that we will discuss in an offline video most probably. If not, then next week. So that was it for the class, and chat is open. If any other questions, any other doubts. All right. You have said the React. Okay, so question is, I did React front. Okay, so Karan, how did he do it? He did console.log user query equal to user query.data and saw a to do there. Okay, got it. Nice, very nice ad hoc debugging technique. A few questions. How to find organizations for GSOC? Should I always ask someone to assign me the issue? Should I create PPR? Ask for permissions. You should ask for permission अभी तो कोई नहीं contribute कर रहा होगा. As long as you're the first one to ask for permission, they will give it to you. ऐसा नहीं होगा तुम्हारे बाद someone else comes, they give it to the next person. If they don't reply for 2 days, after you've asked them, hey, can I work on this issue? Then create a pull request. So that's probably the easier way to do it. Web3 paid mentorship referral, just like your AI friend. Web3 paid referral, Web3 में कौन है? I have a friend. He used to be a YouTuber पहले. I can ask if he's open to it. Change the user GSOC. Sorry. In the return promise part in middleware found this on Stack Overflow, you're not handling asynchronous code correctly. The JWT verify method returns a promise if you don't pass in callback method out. For the return promise part in middleware on Stack Overflow, you are not okay. So it seems like JWT.verify from someone who posted here does return a promise. So let's see. Visual Studio Code. Oh, sorry. So someone said that we didn't have to promisify JWT and it's automatically promisified. So let's see. Const to do equal to await trpc.todo.todo create dot sorry, where was it? Verify. Let's see. What does this verify function return? Void. There are 4 implementation of verify. All 4 of these return a void. None of these return a promise. Are you sure that's the case? And can you point me to the exact Stack Overflow link? Chat is open again. Is there no use of Redux RTK? What's RTK? Redux toolkit. Okay. It is used. None of the projects that I have looked at, like open source projects, have it. It does not mean it's not used. It is used. It used to be used very popularly before. It's not used as much today. But like still fairly popular. Sometimes you might get a client who wants you to build it in Redux. I'm not able to understand anything. So AN Shrinam, did you get to the class yesterday? That's sort of important for sort of prerequisite for this class. And yeah, if not, then you probably have to a lot of catching up to do. I can tell you, if 85-90% of the class understands, then maybe you've not done all the existing classes before. So maybe do that first. Okay, Stack Overflow code. Let's see. The linked copies. What is the use case of callback function in use state? Callback function in use state. I think you're asking. Can you give me an example, Manraj? That's a little vague of a statement. Can you give me an example of a callback function in use state? Stack Overflow. So these guys are using a different library. This is JWKS RSA. We are using JSON Web Tokens. This one might return a promisified response. Ours does not. So that's the difference. You have set the React query to not send request again and again. Is loading becomes true. It won't show loading forever. Same for error. How does the re-render happen in this case? You have set, so I've set it to not send request again and again. Not exactly that. I've said what React query does is if I am on this page, then I go to this page, then I come back to this page, it will resend all the hooks requests and refresh the data. If the data might have changed on the backend, I told it specifically don't do this part. I did not tell it to not get data as new components get rendered. I simply said don't keep refreshing data whenever the focus comes back to the window. And the reason for that was that database is very slow and that request sort of was taking a lot and then was seeing loading for a really long time. That was the reason I told it to sort of not refresh data from the backend. All right. But next middleware's can't response built. But next middleware's can't response is built on edge runtime. So how is middleware blocking it? Can you elaborate? Callbacks. So yeah, you can just send a function in the use state wherever you're trying to create the state, and whatever this function returns, is what will be set as the first argument to TRPC. So if you have, rather than doing where do you see it? See app.ts react/app.tsx. So this is the same as doing, most probably, unless I'm missing something obvious here. This, unless there is something I'm missing here, and there is these are not the same. Why would you use this though? I don't know. There's probably a good reason for it, which I don't know, if I'm being honest. There's probably a good reason to do this versus doing this, which I'm not sure of, but that's a good question. If you know the answer, let me know. Google करके put it here. Why don't you teach Web3? Because अभी ये तो खत्म हो जाए यार. Let's focus on the small things first, and then we can always do that. I'll ask that guy and I'll let you know. Dhanush. Yeah. Assignment for this week. Yes. Course selling application in TRPC using Next.js. So without me telling how to integrate Next.js, I would strongly urge you to try it yourself and do a Next.js application. You can also do to-do application. That works as well. If you can do Next.js, even better. If you can add authentication in Next.js using Next.auth and still use TRPC, that's the best thing. That would be sort of the hard assignment. This was a hard class. This was a hard week. The good thing is, if this feels hard, this isn't used very often. TRPC is only used, not used very commonly, basically. So that's the good thing. The bad thing is, yes, this was a hard class, but this is used very niche projects. So only cal.com uses it. Dub.sh does not use it. The new project that I founded don't use it. Backpack does not use it. So it's not used very often. All right, going to pause the chat. How's the self project idea? I did not get that question. How do you use Next Google provider for sign up? Have I covered this? Yeah, we've covered this in the Next.auth.js class. I think I've covered this in Next.auth.js. If not, tell me. But I think doing Next.auth.js, I may not have. But it's very simple. If you know basic Next.auth.js using email and password, you have to get the right set of credentials from Google, and then you can do login with Google. If I've not covered it, I'm happy to cover it. I think I've covered it. I could be wrong. Difference between NFT token and Web3. They're significantly different, right? Web3 is a field. It's like the difference between full stack development and middlewares. The NFT token, what specific cheez hoti hai? It's like a standard in Web3 that lets you sort of do something which is have a non-fungible token. Now, what does non-fungible mean? Means something. In the second part of the Web3 series, this will come. How do you create an NFT token? How is it different from a normal token? But they're significantly different things. Threads clone with ChatGPT plugin. How exactly does Threads and ChatGPT sort of integrate? But good idea. Sounds like a decent idea. People are willing to pay. You should think. I think will. Yeah. People are willing to pay you. You should. I think I will. I think, okay, you're saying people are willing to pay you for a Web3 class, so you should. Okay, makes sense. But pehle ek ho jaye. Also a full-time job and then full stack. And once this succeeds, completes, we can talk. All right. Chalo guys, let's call it here. थोड़ी सी लंबी क्लास हो गई, but a lot of fun, and again slightly advanced. Don't worry if you do not understand it. You're not meant to understand it. So you're meant to understand it. It's good if you know it, but even if you don't know it, it's still fine because it's a very niche technology. It's sort of hard to understand. I agree. All right. Take care, guys. And I was talking about differentiate sign up and login with Google. Both are same in the case of Next.auth. How to differentiate sign up and login? So yeah, if you don't have that user's ID in your database, that's signing up. If you have them, that's logging in. That's really the subtle difference between logging in and signing up when you're using something like login with Google or login with Facebook. All right. Thank you, everyone. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Yeah, do it again. Look at the docs. 50 bhi samajh aa gaya is pretty good because TRPC is hard, right? Right. See you guys tomorrow. Or not tomorrow, next week. Bye. All right.